Buried deep in the pages of a federal report, among the tables and the projections and the careful, measured language of government analysis, there is a scenario that should have made headlines across the country, and yet it passed almost entirely unnoticed. The report, one of the routine projections the government produces to model the future of the Colorado River system, contained a possibility so alarming that it deserved the attention of the entire nation, and yet almost no one read it or grasped what it was saying. The scenario was this: under certain conditions, in a plausible projection of the future, Lake Powell could fall so low that by the spring of 2027, it would stop making electricity. The great dam that holds back the reservoir, one of the most important power plants in the region, could cease to generate the electricity that serves millions of people, and it could happen sooner than almost anyone realizes. This is the story of that report, and of what it would mean if Lake Powell stops making electricity. In this video, we are going to dig into that report and the scenario it contained and understand exactly what it would mean if it came to pass. We are going to explain what Lake Powell is and why its power generation matters so much. We are going to trace the crucial connection between the water level and the electricity, and the difference between the threshold where the power stops and the even lower point where the water itself stops. We are going to explore who would be hit hardest by the loss of the power, why the scenario is so alarming given how near in time it is, and why a warning this serious could pass almost entirely unnoticed. We are going to consider what could be done to prevent it, and why the near-term time frame makes the need for action so urgent. And we are going to reflect on what the whole episode reveals about the gap between the warnings we receive and the actions we take. Stay with us, because this is a warning that deserves to be read, and understanding it could matter more than almost anyone realizes. To understand the gravity of this projection, you first have to understand what Lake Powell is and why its power generation matters so much. Lake Powell is one of the two great reservoirs of the Colorado River system, an enormous body of water held back by a massive dam and a deep canyon, storing the water of the river for the benefit of the region. But the dam is not only a barrier and a reservoir, it is also a hydroelectric power plant, one of the most significant in the region, generating a large quantity of electricity from the force of the water flowing through it. This electricity is distributed across a wide area, serving a large number of people across multiple states. And it is an important part of the electricity supply for the region. The power generated at Lake Powell is especially important to certain kinds of customers, including many smaller communities, rural areas, and other entities that depend on the relatively affordable electricity that the dam provides. The generation of this electricity depends entirely on the water level in the reservoir. And this is the crucial connection that the federal report was modeling. The dam produces power by allowing water to flow through its turbines, and this requires the water in the reservoir to be high enough to drive the turbines effectively. As the reservoir falls, the water level drops closer to the intakes that feed the turbines, and the pressure and the flow that drive the generation diminish. At a certain level, known as minimum power pool, the water becomes too low to generate electricity at all, because there is no longer enough water above the intakes to drive the turbines. This is the threshold that the federal report was projecting, the point at which Lake Powell would fall below the minimum power pool and stop making electricity. And the report identified the spring of 2027 as a time when, under certain conditions, this could occur. The reason this projection is so significant is that Lake Powell has been falling for years, driven down by the persistent imbalance between the water flowing into it and the water being drawn out, deepened by drought and the warming climate. As the reservoir has declined, it has moved closer and closer to the minimum power pool, the level at which the power generation would cease. And the federal projections have modeled how close it might come and when. The scenario in which Lake Powell stops making electricity by the spring of 2027 is one of these projections, a modeling of what could happen if the conditions align in a certain way, if the drought continues and the inflows remain low and the reservoir keeps falling. It is not a certainty, but a scenario, a plausible possibility identified in the careful analysis of the government, and it is a scenario alarming enough that it should have commanded far more attention than it received. What makes it so troubling that this report went largely unread is that the loss of the power generation at Lake Powell would be a serious blow to the region, affecting the electricity supply of millions of people. When we speak of the dam stopping making electricity, we are speaking of the loss of a major source of power, one that serves a large population and that is especially important to the smaller and less wealthy customers who depend on the affordable hydropower. The loss of this power would not necessarily mean immediate blackouts, because the electricity system is interconnected and power can be drawn from other sources, but it would mean the loss of an important and affordable source of generation, forcing the affected customers to replace it with power from elsewhere, often at greater cost. It would also place additional strain on the regional power system, removing a piece of the supply that helps to keep the system balanced and reliable, particularly at times of high demand. The customers most affected by the loss of the power would be those who depend most heavily on the affordable federal hydropower, particularly the smaller communities, the rural cooperatives, the municipal utilities, and the tribal systems that rely on the inexpensive electricity to keep their rates low for the people they serve. For these customers, the loss of the Lake Powell power would be especially painful because they have fewer resources to absorb the cost of replacing it, and the affordable power is a particularly important part of their supply. The people served by these utilities, many of them in less wealthy areas, could see their electricity costs rise as the affordable hydropower is replaced by more expensive alternatives, adding a financial burden to communities that are often already struggling. The loss of the power would thus fall hardest on those least able to bear it, deepening the disadvantage of the already disadvantaged. A dimension of the crisis that makes it all the more concerning. There is also the technical dimension of how the power fails as the reservoir drops, which helps to explain the significance of the projection. As the level of the reservoir falls, the water above the intakes that feed the turbines grows shallower, and the pressure driving the water through the turbines diminishes. This reduces the efficiency and the output of the generation, so that even before the power is lost entirely, the amount of electricity the dam can produce declines as the reservoir falls. As the level approaches the minimum power pool, the generation must be reduced and eventually halted because the water is no longer high enough to drive the turbines safely and effectively. So the loss of the power is not a sudden switch that flips at a single moment, but the culmination of a gradual decline, the generation diminishing as the reservoir falls until, at the minimum power pool, it ceases altogether. The projection of the spring of 2027 marks the point at which, under the modeled conditions, the reservoir would reach the minimum power pool and the generation would stop. It is important to understand the difference between the minimum power pool and the even lower level known as dead pool, because the report was specifically about the loss of the power, which occurs at the higher of these two thresholds. Minimum power pool is the level below which the dam can no longer generate electricity, while dead pool is lower still. The level below which water can no longer pass through the dam at all. The loss of the power generation, which the report projected for the spring of 2027 under certain conditions, would occur at the minimum power pool before the reservoir reached the more catastrophic level of dead pool. This means that the loss of the power is, in a sense, an early warning, a threshold reached before the ultimate catastrophe, a sign that the reservoir has fallen into genuinely dangerous territory. The projection of the loss of the power by the spring of 2027 is thus a warning of how close the reservoir could come to the critical thresholds and how soon. The scenario in the report is especially alarming because of how near in time it is. The spring of 2027 being not some distant future, but a moment close at hand. The crisis of the Colorado River is often discussed in terms of long-term trends and distant projections, but the scenario of Lake Powell stopping making electricity by the spring of 2027 brings the crisis into sharp and immediate focus, a specific and near-term possibility rather than a vague long-term concern. This nearness is part of what makes the report so significant and its neglect so troubling, because it suggests that the crisis could reach a critical threshold very soon, within a time frame that demands immediate attention and action. The scenario is a reminder that the crisis of the Colorado is not a slow-moving problem that can be addressed at leisure, but an urgent emergency that could produce serious consequences in the near future. Why, then, did this alarming report go largely unread, its scenario passing almost unnoticed? The answer lies partly in the nature of government reports, which are often dense and technical, filled with tables and projections and careful language that can obscure the significance of what they contain. The alarming scenario was one projection among many, buried in the analysis, expressed in the measured terms of government modeling, and it did not announce itself with the drama that its content deserved. The report was doing its job, modeling the possible futures of the system. But the very nature of such reports means that their most alarming findings can be lost in the technical detail, unnoticed by a public and a media that do not have the time or the expertise to parse the projections. The scenario of Lake Powell stopping making electricity by the spring of 2027 was there in the report for anyone who cared to read it, but almost no one did. And so its warning went largely unheeded. This neglect is a symptom of a broader problem: the difficulty of getting the public and the decision makers to focus on a slow-moving crisis until it becomes an immediate emergency. The crisis of the Colorado River has been building for years, the warning signs accumulating, the projections growing more alarming, and yet it has struggled to command the sustained attention that its seriousness warrants. The report that nobody read is a particularly stark example of this, a specific and near-term warning that should have galvanized action and yet passed almost unnoticed. This pattern of alarming warnings going unheeded until the crisis becomes undeniable is one of the great dangers of the situation, because it means that the action needed to prevent the worst outcomes may not be taken until it is too late, until the reservoir has already fallen to the critical thresholds and the consequences have already begun to unfold. The significance of the report extends beyond the specific scenario it modeled, because it is a window into the broader trajectory of the crisis and the dangers that lie ahead. The scenario of Lake Powell stopping making electricity by the spring of 2027 is one possible future among several, but it reflects the underlying reality that the reservoir is falling toward the critical thresholds and could reach them soon. Whether or not the specific scenario comes to pass, the report reveals that the crisis is approaching a point where serious consequences become possible, where the falling reservoir threatens not just the water supply, but the power supply, and where the time frame for these consequences is measured in the near term rather than the distant future. The report is a warning about the trajectory of the whole crisis, a sign of how close the region is coming to the thresholds where the system begins to fail. There is a further reason the loss of the power would matter beyond the immediate cost, and that is the way the revenue from the hydropower supports the broader management of the river. The sale of the electricity produces revenue, and that revenue helps to fund a range of programs related to the river and its management, including efforts to protect the environment and to maintain the system. When the power generation stops, that revenue disappears, and the programs it supports lose their funding, a ripple of consequences that extends well beyond the electricity itself. So the loss of the power would strike not only the customers who buy the electricity, but the whole apparatus of river management that the power revenue helps to sustain, adding yet another dimension to the damage that the scenario in the report describes. The scenario also underscores the interconnected nature of the crisis, the way that the falling reservoir threatens multiple systems at once: water and power and the economy, all bound together. The loss of the power generation at Lake Powell would not be an isolated event, but part of a broader unraveling of the benefits that the reservoir provides. A crisis affecting the water supply, the electricity supply, and the economy of the region all at the same time. This interconnection means that the loss of the power is not merely a problem for the electricity system, but a symptom of a deeper crisis affecting the whole region, and a sign of the multiple ways in which the decline of the reservoir threatens the systems on which the region depends. The report that nobody read was, in this sense, a warning about the whole interconnected crisis, using the specific threat to the power as a window into the broader danger. What could be done to prevent the scenario from coming to pass, to keep Lake Powell above the minimum power pool and preserve its power generation? The fundamental answer is the same as for the broader water crisis, which is to reduce the demands on the river and bring them into balance with the diminished supply, so that the reservoir can stabilize and the decline can be halted. Because the threat to the power comes from the falling of the reservoir, keeping the reservoir above the minimum power pool requires the same measures needed to address the water crisis, reducing water use, improving efficiency, and managing the system to keep the reservoirs as high as possible. There are also measures specific to protecting the power generation, including efforts to manage the operations of the reservoirs to keep the level of Lake Powell above the critical threshold, sometimes by adjusting the releases or moving water within the system. These measures can help to protect the power generation, at least for a time, buying the region more time to address the underlying imbalance. But these measures face the same fundamental challenge as the broader effort to address the water crisis, which is that they require reducing the demands on a river that has been overused for a long time, a difficult and contentious undertaking. Protecting the power generation by keeping the reservoir high requires reducing the withdrawals or managing the system in ways that have their own costs and trade-offs, and these are not easy choices. The competition for the water is intense, and the measures needed to protect the reservoir levels, and thus the power, must contend with the many demands on the river and the reluctance of the users to accept reductions. So while there are things that can be done to protect the power, they are bound up with the larger and more difficult challenge of bringing the demands on the river into balance with what it can provide, and they face the same obstacles that have made the water crisis so hard to resolve. The scenario in the report is preventable, but preventing it requires the kind of decisive action that has so far proven difficult to achieve. The urgency of the scenario is heightened by its near-term time frame, because the spring of 2027 leaves little time to act. If the scenario is to be prevented, the measures to protect the reservoir must be taken soon, before the reservoir falls to the critical threshold. And this requires immediate attention and action, rather than the leisurely pace at which the crisis has often been addressed. The nearness of the projected date is a call to urgency, a reminder that the window for preventing the loss of the power may be closing, and that the action needed must be taken without delay. This is part of what makes the neglect of the report so troubling, because the very nearness of the scenario that should have galvanized action was lost in the technical detail, and the urgency it should have conveyed went unfelt. The report that nobody read was, in effect, a warning that the time to act was short, a warning that went unheeded even as the clock continued to tick. It helps to understand what a report like this actually does, because these projections are a routine and important part of how the Colorado River system is managed. The government regularly models the possible futures of the reservoirs, running the numbers under a range of assumptions about how much water will flow into the system in the coming years, because the future inflows cannot be known for certain. Depending on the weather and the snowpack and the runoff that no one can predict, the modeling considers a range of scenarios, from wetter futures in which the reservoirs recover to drier futures in which they continue to fall. The scenario in which Lake Powell stops making electricity by the spring of 2027 is one of the drier projections, a modeling of what could happen if the inflows remain low and the drought persists. It is not the only possible future, and it is not a prediction that this future will occur, but it is a plausible scenario, one that the careful analysis identified as a genuine possibility, and that is precisely what makes it worth taking seriously. A plausible path to the loss of the power, identified in the government's own modeling, is not something to be dismissed. There is a broader significance to the way the loss of the power connects to the operation of the whole system, because the reservoirs are managed together, and the threat to Lake Powell's power has implications that ripple across the entire arrangement. The two great reservoirs of the system are linked. The water moved between them according to the needs of the system and the rules that govern its operation, and the effort to protect the level of Lake Powell and its power generation can require difficult choices about how to manage the whole system. Keeping Lake Powell above the minimum power pool might require holding back water that would otherwise be released downstream, which in turn affects the other reservoir and the users who depend on the releases. So the threat to the power at Lake Powell is not an isolated concern, but one bound up with the management of the entire system, a factor in the complex balancing of the competing needs of the reservoirs and the users. This interconnection is part of why the scenario in the report matters so much, because the loss of the power is tied to the operation of the whole system, and protecting it requires navigating the difficult trade-offs that the management of the system involves. There is also a profound human and community dimension to the scenario, particularly for the tribal nations and the rural communities that depend on the affordable federal hydropower. For many of these communities, the inexpensive electricity from the dam is not a minor benefit, but a crucial part of their supply, one that helps to keep their costs manageable and their systems viable. The loss of this power would fall heavily on them, forcing them to find replacement power at greater cost, straining budgets that are often already stretched thin, and deepening the challenges faced by communities that are frequently among the more economically vulnerable in the region. The scenario in the report, dry and technical as it is, describes a future that would bring real hardship to real communities, a future in which the loss of the affordable power would ripple through the lives of the people who depend on it. This human dimension is easy to lose sight of in the technical language of a federal report, but it is a crucial part of what is at stake in the scenario the report described. It is worth reflecting on what the scenario of the report reveals about the state of the Colorado River crisis, because it is a sign of just how far the crisis has advanced. The fact that a federal report could plausibly project the loss of the power generation at Lake Powell within a near-term time frame is a measure of how low the reservoir has fallen and how serious the crisis has become. Not long ago, the idea that one of the great dams of the system could stop making electricity would have seemed far-fetched, a distant hypothetical, but the decline of the reservoir has brought this possibility into the realm of plausible, near-term projections. This is a sobering indication of the trajectory of the crisis, the way that the once unthinkable has become the plausibly imminent. And it is a warning of the further dangers that lie ahead if the underlying imbalance is not addressed. The scenario is also a reminder of the value of the careful analysis that produces these reports, even when the reports go unread. The government's modeling of the possible futures of the system, however dense and technical, provides crucial information about the dangers that lie ahead. Information that could guide the action needed to prevent the worst outcomes. The report that nobody read contained a genuine and important warning, a warning that could have prompted the action needed to protect the power generation and the broader system, if only it had been heeded. The neglect of the report is thus not a reason to dismiss such analysis, but a reason to pay closer attention to it, to ensure that the warnings it contains are not lost in the technical detail, but are grasped and acted upon before it is too late. The value of the analysis lies in its ability to warn, and that value is realized only if the warnings are heeded. In the end, the story of the report that nobody read is a story about the gap between the warnings we receive and the actions we take, about the way that alarming information can pass unnoticed, even as the crisis it describes continues to advance. The scenario of Lake Powell stopping making electricity by the spring of 2027 was a genuine and important warning, a specific and near-term projection of a serious consequence of the Colorado River crisis, and yet it passed almost entirely unnoticed, buried in a federal report that almost no one read. This neglect is a symptom of the broader difficulty of confronting a slow-moving crisis, the way that even the most alarming warnings can fail to galvanize action until the crisis becomes an undeniable emergency. And it is a warning in itself, a reminder that the crisis of the Colorado is advancing, that the thresholds where the system begins to fail are drawing near, and that the time to act is short. The loss of the power generation at Lake Powell, whether it comes in the spring of 2027 or at some other time, would be a serious blow to the region and a warning of the further dangers that lie ahead. The report that projected this scenario was a gift, in a sense, a warning that came in time to prompt action, if only the action were taken. Whether the region heeds the warning, whether it takes the steps needed to protect the reservoir and preserve the power generation, whether it acts before the reservoir falls to the critical threshold, remains to be seen. But the scenario in the report is a reminder that the crisis is real, that it is advancing, and that the consequences could come sooner than almost anyone realizes. The report that nobody read is a warning that deserves to be read, a warning about the future of the Colorado River and the systems that depend on it, and a call to act before the day comes when Lake Powell stops making electricity and the warning that went unheeded becomes a reality that cannot be ignored. The story of Lake Powell and the report that nobody read is, finally, a story about the hidden dimensions of the water crisis, the way that the falling reservoirs threaten not just the water, but the power and the economy and the well-being of millions, and the way that these threats can advance unnoticed until they become undeniable. The scenario of the reservoir stopping making electricity by the spring of 2027 is a specific and alarming example. A warning that should have commanded attention and yet passed almost unnoticed, a sign of how the crisis can advance in the shadows even as the world looks away. To read the report, to grasp its warning, to understand the danger it describes, is to confront the reality of the crisis and the urgency of the action needed to address it. The report that nobody read is a call to pay attention, to heed the warnings, and to act before it is too late, before the reservoir falls to the critical threshold and the